The December frost made the auction platform slippery, but Lila stood perfectly still. Around her, the good citizens of Cedar Ridge gathered like crows, their breath forming clouds in the Montana morning. The labor auction always drew a crowd. Watching the desperate sell themselves for winter work was better entertainment than any traveling show. $2, came the gruff voice from the sawmill office doorway. The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-swing. $2 was an insult, barely enough for a day's meal. But it was the only bid Lila had received all morning. Brody McAllister didn't move from his doorway, didn't even look up from whittling. He'd bid on damaged goods before broken saw blades, warped lumber that others passed over. He had a talent for finding use in things others discarded. The girl in the torn dress lifted her chin, meeting his disinterest with dignity that had no business belonging to someone standing on an auction block. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The walk to the sawmill stretched longer than any Lila had taken. Behind them, Cedar Ridge's storefronts buzzed with whispers that followed their steps like autumn leaves. Brody McAllister moved with the steady pace of a man who'd never hurried for anyone's opinion, his buffalo hide coat dark against the morning snow. Lila matched his stride, though her thin boots found every frozen rut in the road. They passed the general store where pickle barrels stood like sentries. Mrs. Hutchins emerged, clutching her wool cape, mouth already opening with gossip for the banker's wife beside her. Brody didn't acknowledge them, neither did Lila, though she felt their stares burning through her threadbare dress. The wooden bridge over Miller's Creek groaned under their weight. Below, ice had captured the water mid-flow, creating sculptures that would last until spring. On the far side, the road curved away from town, following the creek toward the rhythmic thump of the sawmill's water wheel. "You'll handle cooking and keeping house," Brody said, his first word since the auction. "Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Good. There's ledger work needs doing. Man I hired last month couldn't tell a 7 from a 9. The sawmill emerged from the pine grove like something grown rather than built. Stacks of fresh-cut lumber perfumed the air with pitch and possibility. The main building squatted solid and unpretentious, smoke threading from its chimney. A smaller structure leaned against it, quarters for the hired help, Lila assumed. Brody led her to the lean-to. Inside, an iron cot held folded quilts that had seen better decades. A small pot-belly stove occupied one corner, cold now but promising warmth. Rough shelves held nothing but dust and the memory of previous occupants. "Kitchen's in the main building," Brody said. "You'll find what you need there. I take supper at 6. He turned to leave, then paused. "The auction. I needed help before the Christmas orders. Nothing personal." Lila removed her threadbare gloves with careful dignity, extending her hand. "I understand. Mr. McAllister. You'll have your money's worth." He stared at her outstretched hand, small, work roughened, steady, then engulfed it in his calloused grip. The handshake was brief, formal, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that someone bought for $2 would insist on sealing their arrangement properly. When he left, Lila stood alone in the quiet space, finally allowing her shoulders to drop. She'd been sold for less than the cost of a restaurant meal, but she was alive, employed, and sheltered. In the territory of Montana. In December of 1882, that was no small thing. The kitchen was a catastrophe of bachelor living. Lila stood in the doorway, surveying the battlefield where meals had been lost rather than made. The cast-iron stove squatted like a neglected beast, its surface clouded with old grease. Tin plates towered in precarious stacks, some still bearing evidence of meals from days past. A coffee grinder lay on its side, beans scattered across the rough plank floor like river stones. But Lila had seen worse. The orphanage kitchen where she'd worked since age 8 had fed 40 mouths with less than this. She rolled up her sleeves, noting how the torn fabric from the auction still hung loose, and set to work. The storeroom revealed treasures hidden beneath chaos, behind sacks of flour gone hard as cement. She discovered preserved vegetables in mason jars, their contents jewel-bright in the afternoon light filtering through the grimy window. A barrel of salt pork sat forgotten in the corner, still good beneath its protective layer of fat. Dried beans filled a cloth sack, and wonder of wonders, a small collection of wild herbs hung from the rafters. Someone, sometime, had cared about flavor. She hauled water from the creek, heating pot after pot on the stove she'd coaxed back to life. The plates emerged from their baptism gleaming dully in the lamplight. She found a decent knife, whetted it sharp on a stone from the dooryard, and set about transforming neglect into nourishment. The root cellar beneath the kitchen floor yielded potatoes and turnips, sprouted but salvageable. She pared away the bad, saved the good, a skill learned from years of making do. The salt pork rendered its fat gladly, filling the kitchen with a rich aroma that had been absent too long. Beans went into the pot with herbs she'd identified by smell: sage, certainly, and something that might be wild thyme. By the time Brody returned from the mill yard, purple dusk was settling over the pines. He stopped in the doorway much as Lila had hours earlier, but his expression was altogether different. The kitchen glowed with lamplight and cleanliness. His rough table bore a cloth really just a flour sack, but clean and pressed smooth with hot stones. Tin plates sat properly placed, and beside them, folded squares of cloth served as napkins. "Supper's ready, Mr. McAllister," Lila said, ladling stew into bowls she'd scrubbed until they remembered their purpose. Brody sat slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the transformation. He lifted the spoon, polished now, and took his first taste. The expression that crossed his weathered face was worth more than $2, more than 200. It was the look of a man who'd forgotten that food could offer comfort instead of mere sustenance. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" His voice held genuine curiosity, the first real interest he'd shown. "The orphanage, sir. They put me in the kitchen when I was 8. Said I was too small for laundry but had clever hands." She served herself a modest portion, sitting at the far end of the table. "The cook there, Mrs. Brennan, she'd been in service to fine houses before her husband died. She taught me that poor ingredients don't mean poor cooking." Brody studied her over his bowl, in the lamplight, with the shadows playing across her face. She looked even younger than her probable 20 years, but her hands moved with the unconscious efficiency of long practice, and her bearing held that same puzzling dignity he'd noticed at the auction. "The ledgers," he said abruptly. "You mentioned you could read. Can you figure?" "Yes, sir. The orphanage matron had me help with the accounts. Said I had a head for numbers." "Good. Tomorrow you can look at mine. Man, before you left them in a tangle. And Pike, that's my foreman. He's no better with figures than I am." They finished the meal in companionable silence. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the settling of logs in the stove. When Brody pushed back from the table, his bowl was empty, scraped clean as a child might do. "That was—" He paused, searching for words that didn't come easy. "That was fine. Real fine." Lila rose to clear the dishes. "There's preserved peaches, if you'd like something sweet. I found them behind the cornmeal." Peaches. The wonder in his voice might have been comical if it weren't so genuine. "I forgot those were there. Ma put them up. Must be 3 summers ago now." The slip into memory caught him off guard. Lila saw his jaw tighten, the quick retreat into himself. She served the peaches without comment, letting the sweetness speak its own comfort. Later, after Brody had returned to his own quarters and the dishes were done, Lila sat by the dying stove in the kitchen. Through the window, stars pricked the December sky like promises. She'd been sold for $2 that morning, but somehow, stirring stew and seeing a lonely man remember pleasure in simple food, she felt richer than she had in years. Tomorrow there would be ledgers to untangle and more meals to cook. There would be the careful dance of 2 strangers learning to share space. But tonight, with her belly full and warmth at her back, Lila allowed herself to believe that perhaps she'd found not just work, but something that might, in time, become a home. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Winter was settling in earnest over the Montana territory, but inside the sawmill kitchen, where the scent of sage and good food lingered. $2 had purchased something neither the buyer nor the bought had expected, the first fragile thread of connection between two souls who'd forgotten that loneliness wasn't life's only option. Dawn hadn't yet touched the windows when Brody found her. Lila sat at his desk, surrounded by a fortress of ledgers, her profile illuminated by the steady glow of a coal oil lamp. She'd pulled her hair back severely, and in the lamplight, with her pen moving in precise strokes across foolscap paper, she looked like something from another world, a world where numbers made sense and accounts balanced. "You're up early," he said, though his own presence at this hour made the observation hypocritical. She didn't startle, merely glanced up with those steady gray eyes. "The books, Mr. McAllister, they're complicated." That was generous. Brody knew they were a disaster. 3 years of his clumsy attempts layered over whatever system his father had used, all of it made worse by Pike's helpful interventions. He'd hired Lila for cooking and cleaning, but watching her work through the chaos with methodical patience, he wondered if fate had sent him something more. "Find anything?" He moved closer, catching the scent of ink and the faint lavender she must have found somewhere to wash her hair. Lila's finger traced down a column of figures. "These sales to Morrison's outfit in Billings. You're charging them $2 less per board foot than your other buyers. Morrison's been buying from us for years. Gave him a good rate for loyalty. But here," she turned to another ledger, one from the previous year. "Morrison was paying the same as everyone else. The reduction started 6 months ago, just after," she checked a note she'd made, "just after Mr. Pike began handling the Morrison deliveries personally." Brody felt something cold settle in his stomach. He pulled up a chair, suddenly very interested in the numbers that had always seemed like meaningless scratches to him. "Show me." For the next 2 hours, Lila walked him through a trail of discrepancies that painted an ugly picture. Pike had been systematically undercharging certain buyers and, she suspected, pocketing the difference. The scheme was clever, small enough amounts to avoid notice, spread across enough transactions to add up to real money. "How much?" Brody's voice was tight. "Nearly $300 over 6 months. Maybe more, I haven't gone through all the receipts yet. $300. More than many men made in a year. Enough to buy proper equipment for the mill, or to get through a lean winter." Or his eyes fell on Lila, bent over the books to pay fair wages to good help. "Can you fix this? Set up something Pike can't manipulate?" She looked up, a smudge of ink on her cheek that somehow made her look younger and more determined at once. "I can create a double entry system. Every transaction recorded twice, in different books. One stays with you, one with me. They have to match, or we know something's wrong. You learned this at the orphanage." A shadow crossed her face. "After. I worked in a factory office for a year before I ended up back at the orphanage. The owner there, Mr. Garrett, he'd studied bookkeeping in Philadelphia. He taught me the proper way." There was more to that story, Brody could tell, but he didn't push. Everyone in the territory had chapters they'd rather not read aloud. "Do it," he said. "Set up whatever system you think best. And Lila..." He waited until she met his eyes. "This stays between us for now. Pike doesn't need to know what we've found until I decide how to handle it." She nodded, understanding the delicacy. Pike had friends in town, had worked for the McAllisters since Brody's father's time. Accusations would need proof, and proof took time. "There's something else," Lila said, pulling out a sheet where she'd made neat calculations. "Your pricing structure. You're undervaluing the premium lumber, the clear heart pine, and the quarter sawn oak. In Denver, they're paying twice what you're charging. Denver's a long way off. Transportation costs would still leave you 40% more profit. I figured it here. See?" She showed him the numbers, broken down so clearly even he could follow. "And if you sorted the lumber more carefully, sold the premium pieces separately instead of mixing them in with standard boards, Brody stared at the calculations, then at the young woman who'd created them. Where did a girl from an orphanage learn about lumber grades? "I listen, Mr. McAllister. When the buyers come, When your men talk at meals, I remember what I hear. She paused, then added quietly, it's how I survived. Listening, learning, being useful enough to keep around. The words hit him unexpectedly. He'd bought her for $2 because he needed help with housework. But she was offering him something far more valuable: intelligence, skill, and a perspective his isolated world had never provided. Teach me, he said suddenly. The bookkeeping. In exchange, I'll teach you about lumber, really teach you, not just what you overhear, types of wood, how to judge quality, what makes one board worth 10 times another. Lila's eyes widened slightly, the first real surprise he'd seen her show. You'd do that, knowledge for knowledge. Seems a fair trade. He stood, suddenly awkward with the intimacy of the moment. After supper, maybe, when the day's work is done. I'd like that, she said simply. But her small smile transformed her face, revealing the young woman beneath the careful composure. As Brody left for the mill yard, he glanced back to see her bent over the ledgers again, completely absorbed. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce the windows, casting golden light across the chaos of papers she was slowly transforming into order. He'd paid $2 for household help, but he was beginning to suspect he'd received something priceless, someone who could see the potential in things others overlooked, whether in neglected ledgers or a bitter man who'd forgotten that partnership could be stronger than solitude. The day's work called, but for the first time in years, Brody found himself looking forward to evening, to lamplight and lessons, to the quiet company of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant becoming indispensable. He didn't yet recognize the feeling stirring in his chest. Wouldn't have named it hope if he had, but it was there, fragile as first ice, warming despite the December cold. Pike arrived late that morning, whiskey sour and fumbling excuses about a lame horse. Brody watched him with new eyes, seeing the calculations behind the friendly demeanor, the careful way he steered conversation away from the Morrison account. $300. The betrayal stung worse than the theft. But in the office, Lila worked steadily through the tangles Pike had created, her pen scratching truth into columns that had held only lies. And Brody found himself thinking that perhaps the $2 he'd spent at yesterday's auction was the best investment he'd ever made, not for what he'd bought, but for what he was beginning to discover. The list lay between them on the kitchen table, Lila's neat handwriting transforming necessities into poetry. Salt, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, the basics. But she'd added things Brody hadn't bought in years: cinnamon, writing paper, proper needles for mending, soap that didn't strip skin raw. We'll need fabric for winter curtains, she said, pencil poised. The wind comes through those windows something fierce. Brody watched her calculate, figuring cost against need with the same precision she'd brought to his ledgers. A week had passed since the auction, and already his world had shifted on its axis. The house was clean, the meals were remarkable, and the books were beginning to tell their true story. Add whatever you need, he said, and something for yourself, that dress. He gestured vaguely at her patched calico. It won't hold through winter. I can mend it further. No. The word came out harsher than intended. He softened his tone. You represent my household now, in town, dealing with suppliers. You should look respectable. She nodded slowly, adding wool fabric to the list in letters so small he could barely read them. The morning of the supply run dawned crisp and bright, frost painting the world in crystal. Brody had already hitched the horses when Lila emerged from the house wearing something that stopped him mid-motion. His mother's coat, the good one with the fur collar she'd worn to church, hung perfectly on Lila's slight frame. I found it in the trunk, she said quickly. I didn't mean to presume, but my shawl, it's fine. His voice was thick. It should be worn. The ride to town passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by Brody pointing out landmarks where the old Jennings cabin had burned, the grove where bears denned up in winter, the spot where spring floods always took the road. Lila listened with that intense attention he'd come to recognize, filing away information like she was drawing a map in her mind. Cedar Ridge seemed busier than usual, the Saturday before Christmas drawing ranchers from miles around. Brody helped Lila down from the wagon, noting how she held herself straighter in his mother's coat, chin lifted against whatever the town might offer. The mercantile smelled of pickle brine and leather, peppermint and tobacco. Mr. Henderson greeted them with his merchant smile, though his eyes lingered curiously on Lila. They worked through the list methodically, Henderson's boy carrying sacks to the wagon while Lila examined fabrics with careful fingers. She'd just selected a modest brown wool when Mrs. Hutchins swept in with her daughter Caroline, both dressed in their visiting best. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Why, Mr. McAllister," Mrs. Hutchins said, her smile sharp as winter ice. "And your help." "Miss Lila," Brody corrected quietly. Mrs. Hutchins's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Miss, is it? How generous of you, considering where she came from. Though I suppose auction goods can't be particular about titles." Caroline tittered behind her gloved hand. "Mother, really, I'm sure Mr. McAllister knows what he's bought." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lila's fingers stilled on the fabric, but she didn't lower her eyes. Brody felt something hot and protective rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since defending his younger sister from schoolyard taunts decades ago. "What I know," he said, stepping forward slightly, placing himself between Lila and the women, "is that Miss Lila has proven herself valuable beyond measure. She's brought order to my accounts, economy to my household, and respectability to my business dealings." He turned to Henderson. "That brown wool won't do. Show us the navy blue, the good stuff you keep in back, and the green as well." "Brody," Henderson said carefully, using his first name in the way of old acquaintances. "That's $12 a yard. Then measure out enough for 2 dresses." He met Mrs. Hutchins's stare directly. "Miss Lila represents the McAllister mill. She should dress accordingly." The silence that followed was complete. Even Caroline stopped her giggling. Lila stood perfectly still, but Brody could see the slight tremble in her hands. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of 3 generations of McAllisters in the valley, "she's under my protection. Anyone who treats her with less than full courtesy will find themselves dealing with me directly." Mrs. Hutchins' face flushed red, then white. "Well, I never—" "No," Brody agreed. "You never— That's the problem." He turned back to Henderson, who was trying to hide a smile. "Add buttons to that order, pearl, if you have them, and whatever notions are needed for proper dressmaking." They left the store with their supplies and something more, a declaration that would race through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. Brody helped Lila onto the wagon seat, noting the brightness in her eyes that might have been tears, 5 miles out of town. She finally spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" "Made an enemy of Mrs. Hutchins. She has influence. She has a tongue that wags. There's a difference. The money you spent is mine to spend." He glanced at her, saw her fighting tears in earnest now. "Lila, you've saved me 3 times that amount already with what you found in the books. The least I can do is see you properly clothed." They rode in silence for a while, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Finally, Lila said, "No one's ever stood up for me before." "Then they were fools." That evening, after supplies were stored and supper finished, they sat by the kitchen stove while Lila laid out the fabric on the clean table. Her fingers traced the navy wool reverently, as if it might disappear. "I'll need to air out your mother's sewing basket," she said. "The patterns might be old-fashioned, but Ma was a fine seamstress. Her patterns will do well enough." Brody pulled out his whittling, working on something he'd been shaping for days. They sat in companionable quiet, the stove crackling, wind testing the windows. But the cold couldn't enter here, not with fresh supplies stacked in the pantry and good fabric waiting to become new clothes. "I'll teach you about wood grains tomorrow," he said suddenly. "If you're going to represent the mill, you should know what you're representing." Lila smiled, the expression transforming her face. "And I'll show you how the double entry system works. Once you understand it, Pike won't be able to cheat you again." "Pike," Brody said darkly, then shook his head. "That's tomorrow's problem." In tonight, there was peace in his kitchen, warmth from his stove, and a woman whose dignity couldn't be bought or sold working quietly across from him. His mother's coat hung on the peg by the door, looking right there, looking like it belonged. "Thank you," Lila said quietly. "For today, for the fabric, for—" She gestured helplessly, encompassing everything and nothing. "You earned it," he said gruffly, focusing on his whittling. But they both knew it was more than that. In standing up for her, he'd chosen a side in an unspoken battle. In accepting his protection, she'd trusted him with her reputation. They were bound now by more than employment, though neither was ready to name what that binding might be. The evening deepened, and still they sat, working at their separate tasks, but sharing the same circle of light. Outside, winter held the Montana territory in its grip, but inside the McAllister mill, something warmer than fire was beginning to kindle, something that had nothing to do with $2 and everything to do with two people recognizing worth in each other that the rest of the world had overlooked. The navy wool had transformed under Lila's careful hands. Each evening, after the dishes were done and the ledgers balanced, she worked by lamplight, her needle flashing in precise stitches that would have impressed even Mrs. Hutchins. Brody pretended to focus on his whittling, but more often found himself watching the way she frowned in concentration, the tip of her tongue just visible between her lips when she navigated a difficult seam. He was carving something special. Had been since the second night she'd cooked for him. The wood was pine soft enough to work easily, but taking detail well. His father had taught him that the wood itself would tell you what it wanted to become. If you listened, this piece had whispered its purpose from the start. "Tell me about Heartwood," Lila said suddenly, not looking up from her sewing. It had become their pattern. She'd ask about lumber while she sewed. He'd ask about bookkeeping while he carved. "Heartwood's the center of the tree," he explained, setting down his knife. "The oldest part. Harder, darker than the sapwood around it. More resistant to rot. Like people," she said quietly. "The things that last are at the center." He studied her profile in the lamplight. "I hadn't thought of it that way. Show me." He rose, and she set aside her sewing. The evening was mild for December, and they walked to the lumber shed with a lantern between them. Inside, the wood lay stacked like possibilities: pine, oak, a precious few pieces of cherry from back east. Brody selected a piece of oak, showing her the grain with his fingers. "See how the lines run. Straight grain is strongest. But this," he picked up another piece, "this has figure. See the swirls? Makes it prettier but harder to work. Which is worth more? Depends on the buyer. Someone building a barn wants straight and strong. Someone building a gentleman's library wants the figure." She touched the wood reverently, and he found himself explaining things he'd never put into words, how to tell if wood had been properly dried. The difference between flat sawn and quarter sawn boards. Why some trees produced better lumber than others. "Your turn," he said finally. "Show me those double-entry ledgers." Back in the kitchen, she spread out the new book she'd prepared. Her system was elegant in its simplicity, every transaction recorded twice. Once as it affected cash, once as it affected inventory or receivables. "If the books don't balance," she explained, "you know something's wrong. Either a mistake or someone stealing." "Yes." Her fingers guided his through a sample transaction, patient when he struggled with concepts that seemed to come naturally to her. Their hands brushed as she corrected his grip on the pen, and neither pulled away. "You're a good teacher," he said. "I had to be. At the factory, if the younger girls didn't learn fast enough." She trailed off. that shadow crossing her face again. What happened there? Lila, how did you end up back at the orphanage? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, Mr. Garrett's son came home from college. Thought a factory girl would be easy prey. When I fought him off, he told his father I'd stolen from the office. No one believes a girl like me over a gentleman's son. Brody's hands clenched. Garrett's in Denver. Isn't he big textile operation? It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in the lamplight, an understanding that went beyond words. I should work on the dress, she said finally, but she didn't move. I should finish my carving. Still, neither moved. The kitchen held them in its warm embrace, the stove crackling, the lamp casting golden circles on the wall. Finally, Lila reached for her sewing, and Brody picked up his knife, but the air between them had changed, charged with possibility. 3 days before Christmas, they attempted to bake a cake. Lila had found a recipe in his mother's things, written in fading ink on paper soft as cloth. 1 cup sugar, she read, 2 cups flour, 3 eggs if you have them. We have them. Henderson's boy brought them yesterday. They worked side by side, Lila measuring while Brody mixed, flour dusting everything like early snow. The batter looked right, smelled right, but when they pulled it from the oven, it had fallen in the center, creating a crater that could have held a coffee cup. Brody stared at the disaster, then burst out laughing, real laughter, the kind that came from the belly and cleared the soul. Lila tried to maintain her composure, but when he pointed at the cake and gasped, "Looks like that sinkhole out by Miller's place," she lost control too. They laughed until their sides hurt, until tears streamed down their faces, until they had to sit down from weakness. It was the kind of laughter that washed away pretense and distance, leaving only 2 people sharing a moment of pure, ridiculous joy. We could fill it with preserves, Lila suggested, still giggling. Call it a Mountain Valley cake. Brilliant. We'll patent it. Make a fortune. They salvaged the cake with peaches from the last jar, and it tasted better for the laughter that had seasoned it. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The town church bells carried on the wind, calling the faithful to service. Brody and Lila stood on the porch, listening to the distant hymns. They couldn't go. Of course she was the auction girl. He was the man who'd bought her. The scandal would have disrupted the entire service. But standing there, his coat around her shoulders, they had their own moment of worship. The stars above were cathedral enough. The wind through the pines a choir beyond compare. Silent night, Lila said softly, recognizing the hymn. My mother used to sing that. You remember her? Barely? She died when I was 5. Lung fever. My father. She shrugged. He dropped me at the orphanage and never came back. Brody wanted to say something comforting, but what comfort could he offer instead? He drew her slightly closer, letting his presence speak what words couldn't. They walked back slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. In the kitchen, gifts waited, his carving finally revealed as a jewelry box with a sliding lid, her navy dress completed with pearl buttons down the front. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the carefully fitted joints. So is the dress, he said, though he meant more than that. They stood close, closer than employment warranted, closer than propriety allowed. Her hand was still on the box. His hand covered hers, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Lila, he began, not knowing what he meant to say. I know, she whispered. I know. And somehow she did. Knew that he was not a man of words, that his feelings came out in carved wood and fierce protection, knew that something was building between them, slow and steady as seasoned lumber, knew that patience was needed, that trust took time, that hearts scarred by loneliness healed slowly. She stepped back, but her smile was warm. Merry Christmas, Brody. Merry Christmas, Lila. Later, alone in his room, Brody thought about the woman sleeping in the lean-to, the dress she'd made hanging on a peg, the jewelry box on her small table. He thought about Pike and the confrontation that was coming, about the town's gossip and judgment. But mostly, he thought about the way she'd looked in the starlight, his coat around her shoulders, her face turned toward the hymns they couldn't join but could still hear. $2. He'd paid $2 for help with cooking and cleaning. But what he'd found was worth more than all the lumber in Montana, someone who saw past his gruffness to the man beneath, someone whose dignity couldn't be bought or broken, someone who was teaching him that the strongest structures were built not alone, but together. The wind rattled the windows, winter asserting its dominion. But inside, warmth persisted not just from the stove, but from the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of shared work, quiet conversation, and the slow, careful construction of something that might, with patience and care, become home for them both. Pike arrived at dusk on Christmas Day, whiskey heavy on his breath and malice in his bloodshot eyes. Lila heard the horses first too fast for safety on the frozen road and looked up from the books she'd been reviewing. Brody had gone to check on old Sam Tucker, whose cabin was a mile upriver, taking him a portion of their Christmas dinner. She knew trouble when she saw it walking. Pike stumbled through the office door without knocking, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his Windsor tie pulled loose like a noose he'd escaped. "Where is he?" Pike demanded, swaying slightly. "Mr. McAllister is out. Can I help you with something?" Pike's laugh was ugly. "Help me? That's rich. You've helped enough. Haven't you? Turning him against me with your figures and your proper ways?" "I don't know what you mean." But she did. The new ledger system had been in place for a week. Pike had to know his thefts would soon be discovered, if they hadn't been already. "Don't play innocent with me, girl." He moved closer, and she could smell the whiskey, sharp and sour. "I know what you are. Auction trash, orphanage cast-off. You think putting on airs and keeping house makes you respectable?" Lila stood slowly, keeping the desk between them. "Mr. Pike, you should leave. Mr. McAllister will be back soon." "Good. Got things to say to him. About you. About how you've bewitched him. Turned him soft." His eyes narrowed. "But first, let me see those books you're so proud of." "The books are Mr. McAllister's property. I'm his foreman. I have a right." "You have no right." Her voice stayed steady, though her heart raced. "Please leave." Pike lunged around the desk faster than a drunk man should move. His hand caught her sleeve, yanking hard. The fabric, her old dress, not the new one she'd hung carefully away, tore at the shoulder seam with a sound like surrender. "Don't touch me." She pulled back, but his grip was iron. "Touch you? Who'd want to touch auction goods just need to see those books. Understand what lies you've been spreading." She twisted away, but he grabbed for her again, catching her arm and spinning her against the wall. Papers scattered from the desk like startled birds. The inkwell tipped, spreading black across the blotter like blood. "Stop." She pushed against him, but he was bigger, stronger, meaner. "Make me stop. Go on. Call for help. Who's going to come? Everyone knows what you are. $2 girl. Cheaper than a..." The iron skillet caught him across the temple with a sound like a bell being rung. Pike's eyes rolled white, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap of bad intentions and whiskey fumes. Lila stood over him, skillet still raised, breath coming in gasps. Her sleeve hung torn, exposing her shoulder. Her carefully pinned hair had come loose in the struggle, but she stood straight, unbroken. That's how Brody found them 5 minutes later, Pike unconscious on the floor, Lila standing guard with the skillet, looking like an avenging angel who'd chosen cookware over a flaming sword. "Lila." Her name came out strangled. Brody's eyes went from Pike to her torn sleeve to the scattered papers, reading the story in an instant. Are you?" "I'm fine. He wanted the books. Got grabby when I wouldn't show them." Her voice was steady, but he saw the tremor in her hands. Brody knelt beside Pike, checking his breathing. Alive. Unfortunately, the temptation to finish what the skillet had started burned hot in his chest. But Lila's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Don't, she said softly. Don't become what he already thinks you are. He attacked you, and I defended myself. It's done. It's not done. He needs to answer for this. To whom the sheriff who drinks with him every Saturday, the judge who'll see an orphan girl who should be grateful for any attention, her practicality hurt worse than tears would have. If you involve the law, I'll be the one on trial. That's how it works for women like me. Brody stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists. She was right. He hated that she was right. Hated more that she knew it from experience. Then what do you suggest? Fire him. Tell him if he comes back, you'll expose the theft from the Morrison account. $300 is enough to interest even a lazy sheriff. Pike groaned, beginning to stir. Brody hauled him up by his collar, dragging him to the door like a sack of spoiled grain. You're done here, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Clear out your things tonight. If I see you on my property again, I'll have you arrested for theft. Pike's eyes focused slowly. Theft you can't prove. I can prove everything, every false invoice, every skimmed payment. Miss Lila documented it all. He tightened his grip. But more than that, you touched her. You put your hands on a woman under my protection. Be grateful she only used a skillet. I won't be so gentle. Your protection? Pike laughed bitterly. You've gone soft over a $2 whore. Brody's fist connected with Pike's jaw, sending him sprawling in the snow. Get out. Now, don't even pack. Just go. Pike struggled to his feet, spitting blood. This isn't over, McAllister. You and your auction girl, the whole town will hear about this. Let them hear. Tell them Brody McAllister stands behind his people. Tell them anyone who disrespects Miss Lila disrespects me. Tell them whatever you want, Pike, but tell them from somewhere else. Pike stumbled toward his horse, throwing one last venomous look at the doorway where Lila stood, her torn sleeve fluttering in the wind. Then he was gone. Hoofbeats fading into the December night. Brody turned back to Lila, saw her shoulders finally sag. Without thinking, he crossed to her, pulled her against his chest. She stiffened for a moment, then melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt. I was so scared, she whispered, the admission costing her. You were brave, magnificent. That skillet, where did you even... It was on the stove. Still warm from dinner. A shaky laugh escaped her. I might have cooked his brains a little. Nothing there to cook. They stood that way, holding each other in the doorway while snow began to fall. Her torn sleeve bothered him more than Pike's theft ever had. This woman who made so much from so little, who'd sewn her dignity together stitch by careful stitch, and Pike had tried to tear it all away. I'll mend it, she said, catching his gaze on the ruined sleeve. I'll buy you 10 new dresses. I don't need 10 dresses. I just need... She stopped, looked up at him. This close. He could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes, could count the freckles across her nose. What do you need? Lila, to know I'm safe. To know this is real. To know you won't regret choosing me when the town turns on you. I won't regret it. His hand came up to cup her cheek. You're worth more than this whole town combined. Worth more than the mill, the lumber, all of it. You can't mean that. I'm not good with words, Lila. You know that. But I know value when I see it. I know quality from trash. And you're the finest thing that ever walked into my life. She reached up, touched his face with fingers that still trembled slightly. Brody. I know we can't. I know it's too soon, but Lila, I know, she said, just as she had on Christmas Eve. I know. And she did. Knew that he was saying things without words, making promises with his presence, his protection, his poorly contained rage on her behalf. Knew that something had shifted tonight, something that couldn't shift back. Come on, he said gently. Let's clean up this mess. Then you'll show me those books, and we'll figure out exactly how much Pike stole. Tomorrow we'll deal with the town. Together. Together. They worked side by side, setting the office to rights. Lila changed into her new dress, the navy wool with pearl buttons, while Brody made coffee strong enough to strip paint. They spent the rest of Christmas night going through the ledgers, documenting Pike's crimes with meticulous care. But more than that, they spent it together. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, building something that no amount of gossip or judgment could tear down. The torn sleeve lay forgotten on the floor, a reminder that some things, once broken, could lead to something stronger. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Pike's tracks, covering the old year with the promise of the new. Inside, by lamplight and determination, Brody McAllister and Lila no longer the $2 girl, but simply Lila prepared to face whatever came next. They had the books to prove Pike's guilt. They had each other's trust, hard-won and precious. And they had something more, the knowledge that when tested, she had stood strong and he had stood with her. In the Montana Territory. In December of 1882, that was better than any Christmas gift either could have imagined. The sun hadn't climbed above the pines when they arrived. Brody heard them before he saw them, horses and voices. Too many for coincidence. Too early for social calls. He'd been expecting this since Pike had ridden off bloodied and humiliated on Christmas night. What surprised him was that they'd waited a full day. From the window, he counted 8 men. Pike at the front, of course, jaw still purple from Brody's fist. Beside him, Tom Morrison, the buyer Pike had been stealing for. The others were townsmen, some he'd known since childhood, drawn by the promise of drama on a cold December morning. "Stay inside," he told Lila, who was already dressed in her navy wool, hair pinned severely back, looking every inch the respectable bookkeeper. "No." She moved to stand beside him. "We face this together, remember." He wanted to argue, wanted to protect her from what was coming, but the steel in her eyes stopped him. She'd earned the right to stand her ground. Brody picked up his rifle not to threaten, just to have it, in the territory. A man without a gun during confrontation was a man asking to be steamrolled. He stepped onto the porch, rifle laid across his lap as he sat in his father's old chair. Lila stood slightly behind him, hands folded, chin high. "Morning, boys," Brody said calmly. "Bit early for visiting." "This isn't a social call," Morrison said. His merchant's soft hands clenched on his reins. "Pike here says you've made some accusations, says you're letting that girl fill your head with lies. The only lies I found were in my ledgers. $300 worth of lies, to be exact." A murmur ran through the group. $300 was serious money, enough to buy a small ranch or outfit a store. "You can't prove that," Pike spat, though his bravado seemed forced. "Actually, I can." Brody nodded to Lila, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Miss Lila has documented every false invoice, every skimmed payment. Would you like to see the evidence?" Morrison. "Your name appears frequently." Morrison's face flushed. "Now see here. Tom Morrison." A new voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, emerged from behind the horses, her small frame dwarfed by the mounted men but her presence undeniable. "You still owe me for 3 months of washing. Perhaps you pay Pike's stolen money instead." "This isn't your business, Chen," Pike growled. "Is my business when thieves accuse honest people." She looked up at Lila with warm eyes. "This young lady brought me extra work yesterday, paid in advance. She is good woman." "She's auction trash," Pike said. "Bought for $2, like livestock. And yet she's worth more than you." The voice belonged to Pastor Williams, who'd approached on foot, his black coat stark against the snow. "I've been watching, listening. This young woman has brought nothing but improvement to the McAllister mill." "Pastor," Morrison began, but Williams raised his hand. "I'm not finished. Mr. Pike, I've heard disturbing reports about your behavior on Christmas night. attacking a woman, forcing yourself into her employer's office. These are not the actions of an honorable man. She hit me with a skillet. After you tore her dress and grabbed her. Banker Morton had joined the gathering, his presence adding weight to the defending side. My wife saw your condition when you tried to draw money from your account yesterday. A man doesn't get those marks from falling. The tide was turning. Brody could feel it, see it in the way some of the mounted men shifted uncomfortably. These were men with wives, daughters. The image of Pike forcing himself on a woman didn't sit well, no matter her origins. Here's what's going to happen, Brody said, standing slowly, the rifle still casual in his hands. Pike, you're going to leave this valley. Today, Morrison, you're going to pay back what you knowingly received in stolen goods, or I'll pursue legal action. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Brody's voice carried the weight of 3 generations of McAllisters. My family built this mill when this was still Indian country. We've survived floods, fires, and feuds. We'll survive you. And the girl, someone called from the back. What about her? Brody set down the rifle, freeing his hands. He turned to Lila, took her hand in full view of everyone. Miss Lila has agreed to become my wife. The words hung in the crisp morning air. Lila's eyes widened. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't agreed to anything beyond standing together. But she didn't pull away, didn't contradict him. Instead, she squeezed his hand and stepped closer. That's right, she said, her voice clear and strong. Mr. McAllister proposed last night, and I accepted. It was a lie that would become truth, a declaration that changed everything. Several men removed their hats despite the cold, the automatic respect for an engaged woman overcoming their prejudice. This is a mistake, Brody, Morrison warned. You're throwing away your reputation for a girl who saved my business from thieves, who works harder than any 3 men I've employed, who maintains her dignity despite people like you trying to strip it away. Brody pulled Lila closer. That girl, yes, I'm choosing her. Publicly. Proudly. Pastor Williams stepped forward. I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Perhaps this Sunday, after service, you'd marry them. Pike's voice cracked with disbelief. I'd marry 2 people who've shown Christian values in their actions, not just their words, who've demonstrated forgiveness, hard work, and mutual respect. The pastor's mild eyes turned stern. Which is more than I can say for some who attend services regularly. Mrs. Chen clapped her hands once, decisively. I provide wedding dress, have beautiful silk from my grandmother, blue like respect, white like new beginning. And the reception can be at the bank, Morton added, surprising everyone. My wife's been saying we need more community gatherings. The coalition of support was unexpected but undeniable. Pike looked around wildly, seeing his mob transformed into a wedding planning committee. This is insane, he muttered. No, Brody said quietly. Insane was thinking you could steal from me and attack someone under my protection without consequences. Leave, Pike, now, before I decide $300 of theft is worth the sheriff's time after all. Pike wheeled his horse around, but couldn't resist one last shot. You'll regret this, McAllister, when she shows her true colors. The only colors I see, Brody interrupted, are the black and white of honest ledgers and the gold of a true heart. Goodbye, Pike. Morrison lasted another moment before the weight of collective disapproval drove him off as well, muttering about finding another lumber supplier. The remaining men dispersed slowly, some offering grudging congratulations, others simply tipping their hats to Lila in recognition of her new status. When they were alone, except for Pastor Williams and Mrs. Chen discussing wedding details on the porch, Lila turned to Brody. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. The proposal. He cupped her face in his hands, rough thumbs gentle against her cheeks. I meant it the moment you stood up to Pike. Meant it when you wouldn't let me become the violent man he expected. Meant it every time you took something broken and made it whole. He paused, suddenly uncertain. Unless you don't... I meant it too, she said simply, When I said yes just now, I meant it with my whole heart. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. So, Sunday then, after service. Brody looked at Lila, a question in his eyes. She nodded, a smile breaking across her face like dawn. Sunday, they said together. Mrs. Chen bustled forward, already taking Lila's measurements with her eyes. Come tomorrow for fitting. We make you beautiful bride. She's already beautiful, Brody said, then blushed at his own boldness. After the pastor and Mrs. Chen left, full of plans and promises, Brody and Lila stood alone on the porch where everything had changed. From $2 to a wedding in 2 weeks, Lila said wonderingly. People will talk. Let them. They'll talk anyway. He drew her close. I know this is fast, unexpected. The best things usually are. She reached up to touch his face. I didn't come here looking for love. Brody, I came looking for survival. But somewhere between the ledgers and the lumber lessons, between the cooking and the confrontations, I found both. I love you, he said, the words rusty from disuse but true as heartwood. I should have said it sooner. You did, she replied. Every time you stood up for me, every time you trusted me with your business, every time you looked at me and saw more than what I cost, you've been saying it all along. They kissed then, there on the porch where Pike had demanded justice and found it, where a mob had come for scandal and witnessed a proposal instead. It was a kiss that tasted of promise and permanence, of two people who'd been broken by loneliness finding wholeness in each other. The sun had fully risen now, painting the snow-covered valley in gold and shadow. The mill wheel turned steadily, ice crystals catching the light like scattered diamonds. It was December 27th, 1882, and in 4 days, a new year would begin. But for Brody McAllister and Lila, soon-to-be Lila McAllister, the new life had already started. We should go in, Lila said finally. There's breakfast to make and books to balance. And a wedding to plan. A simple wedding, she cautioned. I don't need fancy. You'll have whatever you want, he interrupted. You've spent your whole life making do with less. Not anymore. She smiled, that transformative expression that made her eyes dance. Then what I want is simple you, me, and a life built on something stronger than $2. Done, he said, and sealed it with another kiss. Inside, the kitchen waited, warm and welcoming. Their ledgers lay open on the table, showing the truth in neat columns. The coffee pot sat ready on the stove. It was an ordinary morning made extraordinary by what they'd chosen, what they'd declared, what they'd promised. They worked side by side, as they had for 2 weeks, as they would for years to come. But now there was a new ease between them, the comfortable intimacy of a future assured. The town might gossip. Pike might rage from wherever he fled. Morrison might take his business elsewhere. None of it mattered. What mattered was this, the quiet rhythm of shared work, the warmth of belonging, and the knowledge that sometimes the best purchases were the ones that looked worthless to everyone else. $2 had bought help for an overwhelmed mill owner, but courage, dignity, and love those had transformed a transaction into a triumph. The sawmill had never looked finer. Every surface gleamed with polish. Every window sparkled in the afternoon light. Mrs. Chen had arrived at dawn with bolts of silk and a determination that could have moved mountains. The navy wool dress Lila had made was beautiful, but Mrs. Chen insisted a bride needed silk blue for respect, white for new beginnings, woven together in a pattern that caught the light like water. Stand still, Mrs. Chen commanded, pins held between her teeth as she made final adjustments. You move. Dress not perfect. Lila stood perfectly still, watching through the window as men transformed the main room of the mill. Banker Morton had been true to his word, sending over proper chairs and even a small harmonium. Pastor Williams's wife directed the decoration efforts with military precision, pine boughs and winter berries creating simple beauty. You nervous, Mrs.? Chen asked, stepping back to evaluate her work. Terrified, Lila admitted. 3 weeks ago, I was standing on an auction block. Now. Now you marry good man who sees your worth. Mrs. Chen's weathered face softened. I come here 15 years ago. Husband dead, no English, no friends. Town people cruel, suspicious. But I work hard. Stay honest. Slowly they accept. You do same, but faster, because you have him. Through the window, Lila could see Brody in his father's black suit, the one saved for funerals and weddings. He was showing some neighbor boys how to plane wood properly, patient with their clumsy efforts. One of them was Tommy Morrison, Tom Morrison's youngest, sent by his mother despite his father's anger. Small rebellions, Lila thought, the beginning of change. There, Mrs. Chen announced. You are beautiful bride. Lila looked in the mirror Mrs. Chen had brought. The woman looking back was a stranger, silk-wrapped, dignified, glowing with something that had nothing to do with the dress, hope, perhaps, or belonging. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, time to catch the best light through the mill's western windows. By 3:30, people began arriving. Not many, this wasn't a society wedding, but more than Lila had expected. Doc Henderson and his wife, bringing a set of dishes as a wedding gift. The Turners from the neighboring ranch, their daughters scattering rose petals saved from summer. Even Jacob Stone, the territory judge who happened to be passing through, curious about the wedding that had the whole valley talking. Brody waited at the front of the room, Sam Tucker standing as his best man. The old hermit had cleaned up remarkably, his usually wild beard trimmed and his clothes pressed. He'd told Brody that morning. Your pa would be proud, boy. Choosing character over convention, that's the McAllister way. When Lila appeared in the doorway, the small crowd fell silent. She had no father to give her away, no family to sit in the front row, but Mrs. Chen walked beside her, and somehow that was right, one woman who'd made her own way helping another do the same. Brody's face when he saw her, that alone was worth every cruel word, every slight, every night she'd gone to bed hungry in the orphanage. His eyes held wonder, pride, and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of finding something essential he hadn't known he was missing. Pastor Williams kept the ceremony simple. No flowery speeches about submission and duty, just quiet words about partnership, respect, and building something together. When he asked if anyone objected, the silence was profound. Even those who'd come out of curiosity seemed caught in the moment's gravity. Do you, Brody, take this woman to be your wedded wife? I do. His voice carried the same certainty he used when identifying Hartwood. Do you, Lila, take this man to be your wedded husband? I do. Clear, strong, unhesitating. The ring was simple gold, nothing fancy, but it caught the light as Brody slipped it onto her finger. His hands were steady, calloused from honest work, gentle despite their strength. I now pronounce you man and wife. The kiss was brief, appropriate for public viewing, but Lila felt the promise in it of private moments, shared dreams, a life built together board by board. The reception was modest but joyful. Mrs. Chen's Chinese dumplings sat alongside Mrs. Henderson's cornbread. Someone had brought cider, someone else a fiddle. As the sun set, painting the mill in gold and crimson, people who'd come to gawk stayed to celebrate. Never thought I'd see the day, Sam Tucker said, pumping Brody's hand. You getting married, Pike getting run out of town, and Morrison eating crow all in the same week. Morrison sent a wedding gift, Banker Morton mentioned quietly. A credit at his store. His wife's doing, I think, small victories, Lila thought. The town wouldn't change overnight, but it was bending, slowly, toward acceptance. As the evening wore on, the crowd gradually dispersed. Mrs. Chen supervised the cleaning with the same efficiency she'd brought to dressmaking. Soon, only the newlyweds remained in the mill that was now officially their home. No wedding trip, Brody said apologetically. The orders? I don't need a trip. Lila touched his face. Everything I want is right here. They stood together in the quiet mill, surrounded by the ghost of celebration, a forgotten ribbon here, a pine bough there, Tomorrow would bring work. The endless rhythm of sawing and selling, cooking and calculating. But tonight was theirs. Spring came early that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way. By March, the mill was bustling with activity. Lila's innovative payment system, small advances against future work. Fair wages paid promptly had attracted skilled craftsmen from as far as Helena. The books showed steady profit, honestly earned. More importantly, the community was shifting. Mrs. Henderson now nodded to Lila at the mercantile. The Turner girls came for weekly lessons in arithmetic, their mother insisting on paying despite Lila's protests. Even Tom Morrison had quietly returned as a customer, paying full price without complaint. "We need more space," Brody said one morning, looking at the stack of orders. "Maybe build an addition. Hire more men." "We could afford it," Lila confirmed, running her finger down the ledger. "If we're careful, budget properly." The word still thrilled him. The partnership it implied. She'd transformed his business, his life, his understanding of what mattered. "There's something else," she said, not looking up from the books. "Something we should budget for." "What's that?" She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "A cradle, maybe some tiny clothes, little shoes that won't see much use for a while." Brody stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly like sunrise through pines. "You mean by Christmas, a year after you bought me for $2? She smiled at the memory, no longer bitter. "Seems fitting, doesn't it?" He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair that now smelled of the lavender soap he'd insisted on buying. "Everything about us seems fitting." Christmas Eve, 1883. The table that had once sat 2 now stretched to accommodate 12. The orphanage had sent 3 young people looking for work, and Lila had insisted on hiring them all. Sam Tucker was there, having become a regular fixture. Mrs. Chen presided over the kitchen with Lila, the two of them producing miracles from simple ingredients. "A toast," Brody announced, raising his glass of cider. The baby Sarah, after his mother slept in Lila's arms, tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb. "To choosing people for who they are, not where they come from." "To second chances," Sam Tucker added. "To family," one of the orphans said quietly, then blushed at his boldness. "To family," everyone echoed. Later, after the guests had gone and Sarah was settled in her cradle, Brody and Lila stood on the porch where so much had happened. Snow was falling again, soft and silent, covering the world in possibility. "Do you ever think about it?" Lila asked. "If Pike hadn't been stealing, if you hadn't needed help with the books, if I hadn't been passed over at the auction until you bid." "I try not to think in ifs," Brody said, pulling her close. "But I know this, I would have found you somehow. Maybe not that day, maybe not that way, but somehow. Some things are meant to be." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that still held that dignity he'd noticed from the first, but now held something more: contentment, belonging, love that had grown from respect and bloomed into joy. $2, she murmured, shaking her head in wonder. "The best investment I ever made." Inside, Sarah stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that would soon summon her mother. The mill stood solid around them, full of order and prosperity. The ledgers balanced. The future beckoned bright with promise, and the past, the auction, the prejudice. The fear had faded like last year's snow, leaving only the strength that comes from surviving winter together. They went inside, to their daughter, to the warmth of their kitchen, to the life they'd built from the most unlikely beginning. Behind them, the snow continued to fall, erasing old tracks, preparing the ground for spring. And in the McAllister mill, where love had grown from a $2 transaction, the lamp burned steady through the night, a beacon of hope in the Montana Territory, proving that worth couldn't be measured in money, and that the best things often came disguised as the least. The story of the $2 bride became legend in Cedar Ridge, told and retold until the truth was indistinguishable from myth. But Brody and Lila never corrected the tales. They were too busy living the reality richer than any story, built on dignity preserved, kindness chosen, and love that had transformed a desperate auction into a destiny. The story of Lila and Brody reminds us that true worth cannot be measured in dollars or status. In the coldest winter of her life, Lila stood on that auction platform maintaining her dignity while the town assigned her a value of $2 less than the price of a meal. Yet she never let their judgment define her worth. Instead, she proved through quiet competence, unwavering integrity, and patient grace that human value comes from character, not circumstances. Brody's transformation teaches us about the courage required to see beyond social prejudice. He didn't just offer Lila employment, he offered respect, protection, and eventually his whole heart. Together, they built something the town's wealthiest merchants couldn't purchase: a family founded on mutual respect, a business built on honesty, and a community table where orphans found belonging. Their story shows us that gratitude isn't just about being thankful for what we have, it's about recognizing the inherent worth in every person, especially those society overlooks. When we choose to see people for who they truly are, rather than what others say about them, we don't just change their lives, we transform our own. Have you ever witnessed someone being devalued or dismissed simply because of their circumstances? Much like Lila at the auction, how did it change your perspective on human worth?